panelists, Mr. Ong Boon-Hui, CEO of Stewardship Asia Center, and Professor UMAKANTH VAROTTIL, professor of the National University of Singapore. And our third panelist is Professor Guo Li of Peking University Law School. Okay, why don't you start, Mr. Ong?
Good morning. I don't have professor before my name. So I'm very happy to be here this morning in a forum like this, and this is the second time I'm participating. The previous time was in Singapore and US when it was somewhat of a similar panel. Now, I would very much like to use the 5 to 10 minutes to share from a practitioner or practical perspective, and not so much on commenting or on what the two speakers has shared, but very much building upon it, and perhaps where I could provide some better resolution in some aspect, or where I could provide perhaps a different perspective, asking questions from somewhat a different perspective. But by and large, I would say that I wanted to congratulate the two speakers, especially Bill in his very wide-ranging as well as comprehensive study over 5 years on state-owned enterprise. Now, if I may ask Professor Kim, I will try to take up as little time, but 5 to 10 minutes is not much of a time. So because I don't have the benefit of slides with me, if I do get close to the 10 minutes, please just shut me off. So then we can go into discussion. Because in the course of discussion, sometimes it may get carried away. Now let me just highlight on 3 points. Point number 1, I would like to build upon the point about, you may call it the emergence as a sovereign wealth fund over the last 10 years. Some call it a phenomenon, some call it a concern, some call it the invasion of SWF, some call it a SWF phobia. But all said, sovereign wealth fund is indeed a phenomenon over the last 10 years. And if you really study it, there are many studies over the last 10 years, and upon closer analysis, some studies actually say sovereign wealth fund is but a small portion of the total institutional investment funds out there. So some study put it at 6%, it's somewhat $6 trillion, but there's no two ways about it. It has attracted a lot of attention, and it's a growing influence. It is very much something that has been studied and discussed in many sectors. And if we really analyze it from various angles, from practical angle, from academic angle, even from political angle, there are indeed some reasons for these concerns. Now, some of these concerns are real. I would say some are perceived, may even be misperceived, some are exaggerated. But indeed, there is this concern. So what are these concerns? Why are there these concerns? One, I think it's the ownership, because it is government-owned. Well, there are many forms of institutional investments. These come into the category known as government-owned. Of course, that's one way of looking at it. The other way is, if you look at what chart that Professor Bill has put up, there's always been government ownership, whether it's state-owned enterprise, pension fund, direct economic activities of the government. This is a new category that came about, and it is a new category because somebody coined the term sovereign wealth fund. So it became a new category, and nothing wrong with the term because it is indeed sovereign and it's wealth. But it is now a class of its own, a fund. One is the ownership, and initially it was not as directly stated, but more and more study has started to use where this concern comes from. And this concern very much sometimes comes from political control. Now, there's a fear of because it's government-owned, there's a control. Well, as I said, some of these concerns are real, some are perceived. A second area that this group of institutional investors becoming, I suppose, unique on its own is it doesn't have liabilities. It doesn't go out there to raise funds nor borrow money. And because, of course, this is due to the fact that it is totally government financed. It is government-owned assets. Third is what sort of investment and how are the investment decisions conducted? And fourth, I think that is probably the part that has the most attention, and that is corporate governance. And that's why the topic of study, the topic of discussion is very much on corporate governance, again linked to transparency and so on. But all of us know governance is not just about not doing the wrong thing. Governance is also about doing the right things. Government is about conformance and performance. But if you think about at the initial stage of the so-called the event where sovereign wealth fund was coined, there's nothing to talk about in terms of performance background because it was new. So a lot of the perception or concern are particularly due to conformance. In other words, this group stare in the face of a lot of the traditional so-called corporate governance structures and so on. Now, again, I think there are a lot of real aspect to it, and over the last 10 years, I think a lot of this has been studied in details, and indeed, that will lead me to a second point about a lot have been done over the last 10 years in terms of being more discerning across the board. But before I get to that point, if I may just ask to pause for a moment and think about the backdrop of the economy, the world economy and Asian economy, or the backdrop of where these sovereign wealth funds, so-called the classification of sovereign wealth funds, are located. What is the economic backdrop of that? And maybe some of the studies could, instead of looking at, also look at perspective of what are the alternatives. So what happened over the last 10 years, 15 years, economy in many of these countries are booming. Booming. I mean, you just look at China, the reserve or the positive earning that it's getting. Or you look at the oil-rich country, resource-rich country, because of oil prices going up. For one reason or another, sovereign wealth were accumulating. And that is a fact. Many of the countries started to have, I mean, across the world actually, but in Asia in particular, many of the countries started to have large accumulation of sovereign wealth. And that is why the term, I think, is appropriate. Where does sovereign wealth typically goes to? Well, China can continue to buy US bonds, and it's already buying lots of US bonds. Well, it can continue to invest in huge, some countries can continue to invest in huge infrastructure, build the most beautiful cities in the world, and that is also happening in many of the countries. Or you can think about how to invest them better. Now, again, I'm not being an apologist for anybody now. If you, as an individual or a family, has got wealth, what do you typically do? There are many ways to do it. You can hide it under the pillow. That's one way. You can say savings is important, and some of those academic studies I have read put stabilization as a cause and saving as a second cause. Now, to me, saving doesn't mean preservation, only preservation. Savings means growing. And that is what stewardship is about. Stewardship has got two components. One is, how does one take something, an asset, grow it over long term, and in the process benefit your stakeholders, as well as stakeholders here is defined wider, and as well as benefit community at large. And the second definition of stewardship is anyone who is entrusted with the responsibility and assets has got the obligation to grow them over long term and hand them over in better shape to the next guy, to the next generation. So one of the things that, one of the aspects that drive many of this is intent, whether the impact is the same or whether the implementation and the outcome coincide with the impact is something to be studied and debated. But indeed, there's this long-term aspect of growing the wealth that you are starting to accumulate, whether it's through inflation of oil prices or resource, or whether it's literally your economy is doing very, very well. And so there's this aspect of organizing it into some form of a closer to commercial investment as you can get. So that's one of the definitions that I thought Professor Beer in his presentation put very well. There are about 6 points in the so-called criteria of sovereign wealth fund, and one of them, it should be commercially managed. So, okay, and so he's exercising his my request. So just to wrap up in 2 points, the 2 points, and I didn't have a chance to elaborate. Second point I wanted to make, without elaborating, is over the last 10 years, I think a lot have happened, particularly thanks to the academicians and many of the studies I've made. There are a lot more understanding and there are a lot more discernment. That is exactly the point. Sovereign wealth funds are not homogeneous. In fact, they are as non-homogeneous as you can get. And so there are a lot more understanding now that there are different types of sovereign wealth funds, although they are still classified together. And another aspect, I think, over the last 10 years, many of the sovereign wealth funds that are so-called listed in sovereign wealth fund studies are also beginning. It's a process. Many of them, maybe it takes too long, maybe it's too slow, but many of them are actually moving to the process of corporate governance. In fact, because of the backlash, they are quite careful not to take on controlling stake. That caused another criticism. Sometimes it's do you them, don't do you them, because they cause another criticism that, oh, if you are active shareholders, you should be putting more, you should be putting nominated directors on it. But many of them, because of the perception, has tried to ring back. And finally, I wanted to say that actually, going forward with a lot of this discussion, something like this, that's what we are discussing today, plus all the studies, I think there will be a lot more discernment put into differentiating and tightening up some of the definition. In fact, I will say that a tight definition is useful. If you tighten up the definition and you define that if it's an operating company, should not be within the sovereign wealth fund, then there will be a group that has it. If you tighten it another way, there will be another group that will exit. So having said that, I just wanted to stop here and perhaps we can discuss further within the discussion itself.
Thank you. I'm very glad indeed to be here this morning, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me here. I am an academic, so I will react to the papers that have been presented. And I don't have much practical experience to share on this topic. So we've been treated this morning to two very interesting but divergent papers. One which focuses a lot on ownership, and the other which almost disregards ownership, but both of which are equally important, and I think it's a very interesting thing that they've been combined in this one session. So starting with Professor Megginson's paper, of course, it brings tremendous value because it's a very comprehensive study of sovereign wealth funds across so many different parameters. So it brings a lot of richness into this debate. So just in reaction to this paper, I'd like to pose 3 points maybe that struck me from this discussion. The first one is, what is the objective of a sovereign wealth fund? And when I use the term sovereign wealth fund here, I don't mean to use it in your technical sense. So in some sense, it might involve state-owned enterprises as well, because some of this might apply to state-owned enterprises too. So is the objective of a sovereign wealth fund only financial returns, or are they going to be political or other strategic goals as well? Now, this is quite a controversial issue. And as your research suggests, there is some sovereign wealth fund discount that might indicate that there is some apprehension as far as political goals are concerned. But we don't see anecdotally too many big cases where, except for some CFIUS investigations, where people have been concerned about sovereign wealth funds in other jurisdictions. So when investing outside, there seem to be little concern. And as you've rightly pointed out, some of it may have been unfounded. But the more interesting issue is how are sovereign wealth funds or even state-owned enterprises treated within their own countries in which they have been created. And there is some interesting analysis. And a lot of justifications have been made, including by Professor Milhaupt in the context of China, where they attribute this to political legitimacy in terms of sovereign wealth funds or state-owned enterprises, because there is some reason as to why governments use sovereign wealth funds and state-owned enterprises to legitimize their own existence, either in a single-party system or even perhaps in a multi-party democracy like Singapore, where historical analysis becomes important. So the first question is, how do we actually put our heads around this question about objectives of sovereign wealth funds? The second would be corporate governance. And Mr. Ong has already alluded to it. What is the role of sovereign wealth funds in corporate governance of companies in which they invest? And we would intuitively believe that sovereign wealth funds are going to be passive investors, and maybe rightly so, because they don't want to muddy the waters by engaging too much in companies. But at the same time, there is some trend that has been emerging where sovereign wealth funds have begun to vote extensively in the companies in which they invest. And what struck me was a comment that was made by the fund manager of the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. He said, we would like to be active investors and not activist investors. So what that really means is they would like to vote, maybe exercise their veto powers, but they may not go to the extent of nominating directors on the board or engaging like hedge funds or private equity funds would do. So that's an interesting kind of a via media that we need to think about in terms of what exactly are the corporate governance roles of sovereign wealth funds. And to that extent, it seems to be very different from passive investment and kind of also different from activist investors such as hedge funds and private equity firms. And the third broader question which Professor Megginson raised in his remarks is there a benchmark standard for sovereign wealth funds? And this is a very difficult question because on the one hand, you have entities like the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which are entirely transparent, quite open, very clear about what they want to do. And then you have the other extreme where sovereign wealth funds take pride in being opaque. Right? It's almost like that is one of the basic premises on which they operate. And so how do we actually lift up the standards? And to that extent, I think both Norway and in the Asian context, Temasek have been playing the role of trying to set standards for other sovereign wealth funds to follow. And transparency has also come out as being a very important aspect of this. And so that's another question which we need to think about. And I know in your demeanor during your presentation, you seemed a little pessimistic about the Santiago principles and all kinds of efforts towards bringing up these standards. But how do we build up these standards is another issue that we need to think about. So I think these are the three questions or thoughts that I had on Professor Megginson's paper. Professor Milhaupt's presentation too, very interesting, very out of the box in terms of thinking about China, different from what we've been thinking about traditionally. I think the first thing which struck was it was almost like the controlling shareholder doesn't matter all that much, right? Who's the controlling shareholder doesn't matter because there's a lot of power that is given to the managers within the company. So this may actually make corporate governance in China focus a lot more on managers than we may historically think about, where the focus is more on controlling shareholders. And the second question, again, it goes back to a point that you made. Is it a question of causation or correlation in terms of the relationship between the political class and the managers? So for example, I can think of like a Jack Ma, for example. Was he already a member of the political party when he started Alibaba? Or does that something that gets dragged in along the way? So to that extent, is political affiliation all that relevant, especially in the case of new age companies, is the second question that we need to think about. And the third question, and I'll just stop with that, is A lot of your analysis, I'm wondering if it is specific to China or can it be replicated in other countries as well? And to some extent, I think you've answered that in your presentation when you said you don't think there are many other countries, maybe other than North Korea or Cuba, where the party has so much of an ingrained association with the business class. But I noticed that Economist came out with or it has updated its crony capitalism index, where China ranks 11th. So there must be 10 countries above China. So how does all this operate in the context of the Chinese situation? So I think these are some of the questions to think about. And again, a lot of it may also be very politically driven and also depends on the legal system and the institutions involved. So for example, China has been trying to emulate Singapore. But the question is that going to work? Because Singapore has a very strong public governance, which also translates into corporate governance. Whereas, is the same thing going to work in China or not? I think that's an open question. So these are some of the thoughts to consider as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor King, and good morning. I think I will start with a few thanks to the organizers, to the European delegates, to the fellows and colleagues across the world, particularly Kanda Sensei. It's truly an honor for me to be here. Two professors, they did a terrific job. In my opinion, the two topics, SWF and SOE reforms, they're well interconnected. The bottom line is both of them mean the state controls. In China, the larger financial institutions of systematic significance, the equity of them are often owned or partially owned by our SWF, CICs, or its subsidiaries. The CICs, they have been researched on both the Norwegian models and the Singapore models. My hint is they are leaning more to Temasek or Singapore models. In many regards, I think China is a fan of Singapore's. But whatsoever, SWF is indeed an issue for Chinese financial SOE. With respect to the SOE itself, 3 points to make. The first one is SOE reform is an ongoing hot issue in China now. 4 years ago, when President Xi Jinping took his office, one slogan is to deepen the reform, including the SOE reform. As a matter of fact, a few days ago, the CSEC and the Ministry of Finance just released a new rules, outline the principles need to be followed by the SOEs when issuing new shares and collect monies or transfer assets. The problem is, so far as we had mixed signals. In some occasions, the top leaders say we should develop, we should grow the SOEs bigger and stronger without hesitation. On the others, top leaders also say we should downsize the SOEs to the optimal levels, particularly get rid of those zombie firms. So it's indeed confusing. That's why for the mixed ownership reform, as Curtis mentions, my impression is so far as there are more words than acts done. So the second point is about the central SOEs versus local SOEs. China is a large country. In addition to Beijing, the central government, we have several levels of local governments. Most small and medium-sized local SOEs, they were gone. One Prime Minister Zhu Rongji, he was in power. But there are large local SOE remain. So for the valuable assets, for the profitable business opportunities, the large local SOEs, they're competing with other firms, including financial investor firms, including the private firms, even the central government controlled SOE. The third point is I agree with Curtis, the dichotomies between SOEs vis-a-vis the POE, private-owned enterprise, might be oversimplified and misleading. Because on one hand, some SOEs, the impact of government is hollow. In another word, they are insider or manager controlled. On the others, for private-owned companies, they are quite politically influential, including the internet companies and the high-tech companies. Within China, we often talk about BAT, B-A-T, Baidu, Chinese versions of Google's, large research engines also in Japan's, Alibaba, Jack Ma, and also Tencent's. They have a lot of leverage when dealing with government. Those 3 points, I believe, are the big pictures, but inevitably, they have implications on corporate governance at the technical levels. I give you a few examples. How the directors or independent directors get selected, and in what circumstance those directors should be excluded from voting. And sometimes even quorum itself, how it's calculated, become an issue. I think I also agree with Curtis. Control in China does not necessarily mean in the format of ownership. There are other ways, means to achieve that. The party committees, appointment of a manager, access to finance, and also regulation, enforcement. I'm doing a research with Professor Katharina Pistos, also from Columbia, try to decode how Chinese financial firms, state-owned, is operating, in what sense they're different from their foreign Western peers. To sum up, state capitalism is a very catching and colorful terms. Ironically, for years, Chinese government keeps saying, quote unquote, socialism with Chinese characteristic, where others argue that it might be more true for the capitalism with Chinese characteristic. I think the answer, the conclusions largely depend on how you choose the benchmark. To make the issue more complicated, we are talking about a moving target in a very long spectrum. It's not easy job for foreign observant, and not an easy job even for Chinese ourselves. That's also the reasons I look forward very much to listen to the opinions, the ideas, the insight from you guys. So I stop here.
Before we invite questions or comments from the floor, I'd like to get some responses from
Oh, they're superb questions. I'll try to keep it brief, and I wasn't jotting notes, so I'll try to remember it. Let me take them in turn. Your point, Ong, is about state-owned enterprises is quite important. Temasek, as we talked this morning, is largely a state-owned. It actually owns and operates businesses, and it is pretty much an outlier there. The Norwegian fund is the class of the league. Now, when it invests, it is non-controversial. It is very welcome wherever it goes in the West, the United States, Norway, or Australia. If it's from a non-democratic society, it is just unequivocal. This will be met with hostility. It's going to happen. If it's a state-owned enterprise from a non-democratic society and you're investing in the West, you're just going to, whether you should or not, you're going to encounter reaction, hostility. That's a given. So how do you overcome that? Well, you become more transparent. I mean, this is the only solution that can possibly be given there. Now, you asked a fundamental question. I love it because I've spent the last 25 years in particular working on privatization, state ownership. What is the purpose of state ownership, and what is the purpose of state-owned enterprises? Ultimately, it's going to be to create wealth and to enhance the social welfare of society. Can that be done through state-owned enterprises? I'll go out on a limb. Again, I've studied for 25 years. No, frankly. I mean, ultimately, I think it's having to write a survey this summer. Ultimately, private ownership is simply better. And I'll be happy to debate that. To give an example, if you go to 1980, there was only one country in the world that had privately owned telephone company, the United States. Every other country was either wholly or fully. How many countries would you argue should have state-owned telecoms today, fully state-owned? Around the world, in China, you know the research better than I do, that the profitability and the efficiency of the private sector, even with all the caveats to it, is so much higher than state-owned enterprises. Should they get bigger? Absolutely not. One of the things in reading Professor Milhoff's paper is just the control these have on key sectors. There's no antitrust. They completely dominate, and there's a huge industrial, social, economic cost to having that. Ultimately, I don't think there's a way around that other than transparency, private ownership, opening it up to competition, and breaking it down by size. I don't want to take up too much time here, but I think those are the key points that I wanted to make. Excellent responses. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll be very brief. I thought these were great comments too, and I agree with everything that was said. I think also just picking up on Bill's point, I mean, what is the objective? I mean, that is one of the key questions and conundrums here. I don't disagree with the way you formulated it, that it's to create wealth for society, but that clearly is not the view of governments that are maintaining ownership of these enterprises. And so, you know, that goes back to the point that 20 or 30 years ago, there was speculation that SOEs would die out. Hasn't happened, and in fact, they're still there. You could argue that they're stronger and more important actors today than they've ever been. And so, governments clearly are using them for something else. Otherwise, they would be privatized. So, I think that's the conundrum. Just one point: you raised Jack Ma, UMAKANTH, and I just a comment on that. The Wall Street Journal recently ran an article right on this point. You know, you asked the question, sort of, which came first? You know, Jack Ma or the party, in effect. And you know, the article, I have no way of assessing its accuracy, but the gist of the article was that Alibaba is getting closer and closer to the party for the reason that that's where its bread is buttered, and so it's snuggling up to the party. And there was a recent proposal, and Guoli can tell me, I'm forgetting the what industrial sector this proposal covered. There's a proposal that every member of a certain industry should be part of a party organization or trade group, and there was euphoria over this proposal because it means that with that will come the benefits, the rents of being close to the government. So I think it's, you know, we're thinking about incentive structures. To my mind, the key problem is that the incentives, you know, incline all firms toward the state as opposed to competing on the basis of products and services. And that doesn't mean, of course, that there aren't innovative firms, but over time, the structure will incline them toward the party state. And in the long run, that seems disastrous for China.
Can I respond to one quick thing that Curtis said? The rise of state-owned enterprises and the fact that they seem to have had something of a renaissance. There's some truth to that. At the same time, there's really two outliers that have driven that. The rise of China. You know, the rapid rise, historic. We've said it last night. Money doubles in 72. So if you have 8% real growth in the Chinese economy, that economy is going to double in 9 years, quadruple in 18, 5 times as big in a generation. With no population growth, you're going to have citizens who are 5 times as wealthy as their parents. This has never happened before. Okay, so one is the rise of China. The other great outlier industry has been oil. That has always been state-owned, the real resources. This is changing. This is starting to change now, and fundamentally, at $50 a barrel, it is going to change completely fundamentally.
Okay. Please disclose your name and association.
very much. My name is Lauri Krishna. I'm the Dean of Asia and Western Institute. Enjoyed very much Dr. presentation. I'd like to ask about the performance of various software funds. That may be caused by incentive mechanisms of those asset managers and so on. So there must be different incentive mechanisms. And secondly, in Japanese case, corporate pension funds did very badly. Performance was very bad. One of the reasons is the top management rotate every 2 to 3 years. They don't want to make their performance negative during their in power. Then they tend to invest into government bonds. Right. So I think those kind of structure may apply some countries. So those are the two questions. And then Professor Melhout's question is, I was in China this Tuesday and Wednesday. We discussed about bad loan problem of SOE, how to resolve it. So the governance structure, in case of closing those companies or restructuring those companies, is state-owned or private be better? And is the mixture is better, especially they are facing with restructuring processes?
I guess he asked me first, so I'll go first. Regarding the performance of state-owned enterprise, sovereign wealth funds, if you want to know Norway's, look at their website. They have their holdings. They know exactly. They show exactly what they're doing. Temasek is fairly transparent, and again, those two have really outperformed the market. You want to know what ADIA, Abu Dhabi, or the Chinese? They say what they have, but they don't disclose their holdings. My take is that they're probably far worse than they say. If they were good, wouldn't they be trumpeting their returns? The fetish, somebody called it the fetish of opacity or of not transparency, is really hurting them. I'm sorry, I'll do this. I think that, why don't you at least assets under management? So the quick answer is we simply don't know. My take is it's probably worse than they disclose. Certainly worse than the BlackRocks of the world or the other more transparent private funds. For pension funds, yes, that if you're going to have safety above all else in this rate environment, yes, you're going to definitely underperform. Over time, I guess I've seen the studies that Japanese pension fund has really, it's huge, but it has very poor performance. That could be corporate governance or it could be asset allocation. How do you solve that? With incentives of bureaucrats, that you don't pay people to be asset managers, you pay them to be stewards. It's kind of a hard decision.
Thanks for the question. Which firms would be more susceptible to resolution or workout, state-owned enterprise or private? I think I would defer to President Gwilly's expertise on this, but two things come to my mind. One problem is that there's been an implicit government guarantee basically covering all forms of debt in China. So that has to somehow be managed out of existence in a way that's orderly. One way to do that would be the bankruptcy process. My understanding is that China does have a bankruptcy code, but that it's politically problematic to enter the bankruptcy process because it implicates layoffs and potential for the unrest, social problems that might lead to. So the courts are reluctant to accept cases without an okay from the political officials. So I think I don't have an answer to your question. Which would be more susceptible, state-owned or private. I think you could make arguments either way, but I think the fundamental issue is that there are basic problems. There isn't really an infrastructure yet for working out any troubled firms, and so that's going to have to be developed. And until then, I think you're going to have a lot of zombie firms in China. I think one interesting question is, does China have anything to learn from Japan and its problems over the last 20 years? Japan had a problem with zombie companies as well, and so I'd be interested to hear what Japanese think about whether there are lessons from the Japanese experience that might be applicable to the Chinese experience.
Okay. Any comments or questions?
So I have a question for Curtis. It may be a bit unfair, but I referee numerous papers on Chinese boards because in finance it's a very hot topic to write papers about Chinese corporate governance. And I'm just wondering, maybe similar to the disclosure problems that sovereign wealth funds have or whatever, how can one tell if the authors actually know what they're talking about?
Well, I don't really have much to say about that. I mean, it's a system that is very hard to get into. I mean, it's a kind of, peeling back the layers of the onion quality about the system. And what has struck me in climbing the learning curve is how interconnected things are. And so the skepticism that I would have about a paper that just looks at corporate boards, are they how many independent directors do they have, and so on, is that you're really just looking at a very thin slice of the picture, and you may be missing what's really doing the action. So I don't know how you would tell, a specific author knows what they're talking about, but I'm very skeptical of any approach to Chinese corporate governance that looks in minute detail at one tiny slice of it without trying to connect it up to the larger system.
Yeah, I'd like to, if I can respond to that as well quickly. You do a lot of corporate, for about a decade, I did a lot of privatization studies, 6 or 7 of them. It was fun because they all made the same mistake. So I was able to make a comment that sounded like I knew what I was talking about. Basically, what they all did was they took the privatization in most countries, the government sells its stock, all the money goes to the government. It's not a capital raising event for the company. China's different, as they are in everything else. In China, most of the privatizations are primary share offerings. So the government doesn't sell its stock, they simply, the denominator increases. So it was a very easy mistake that everybody made. Again, this is different because all of finance literature, as you know, shows when you raise capital, that usually is not wisely used. So the performance literature on privatizations in China was subpar compared to most other countries. That was one reason.
It seems to me that China did draw a lot of interest and attention. I agree with Curtis. Many issues in China, they are interconnected. Additions to the SOE reforms and SWF, the bad loan, the bad assets, they are, so the other side of the same coin. Another thing I did not mention is the PPP. The public-private partnership. It's a new idea. The Chinese government has been selling in the recent years, also related to the privatizations, to get help from the private sectors to financial the public project. Due to the similar reasons, so far as not that much progress made. I guess the main concern is how to persuade, how to convince the private sectors, without bringing in too much troubles and too much interventions from the government side. Generally speaking, I should make it clear. I come from Beijing. It does not necessarily mean I will be the defenders for Chinese policies. For me, China in the past years, it's kind of like Cristiano Ronaldo's, the Portuguese soccer players. No offense, many people dislike him. On the other hand, so far as he performed quite well, maybe even beat France to win the European Cup titles. So I think it's well make things tricky and. Anyways, I think the debate will be going on for a while. Thank you.
I think we can have, the last question.
Thank you very much. Soichiro Kozuka of Gakushin University, Tokyo. And thank you very much for the insightful, very insightful A2 presentation. And well, a question to Professor Mason. And so you write in a paper that the sovereign wealth fund is formed partly to introduce more transparency to the kind of the authoritative system in less democratic countries. You name, say, the case of in Nigeria or Angola. And so my question is, number one, is it what are the political implications of doing this? And is it kind of making those countries more democratic, more transparent? And if so, then why political leaders choose to do that? And number two is, if that is the case, is there any chance for a kind of emerging a globally shared standards for those sovereign wealth funds to comply with, just like the stewardship code that Japan introduced 2 years ago? Thank you very much.
Very good question, thank you. Let me answer the second one first. Is there a global standard of corporate governance? I actually think there is. Again, what I've looked at for the last 25 years is privatizations. Privatizations, they're the big companies, telecoms, utilities, airlines, steel. And what they do, that when you privatize, they basically all kind of look like each other. So if you do a big German privatization, you have a company that looks like another global business in its corporate governance, its leverage, its dividend policy, much more than it looks like a big German private company. So yeah, I think there actually is a global standard of good corporate governance, good corporate financial management. Yes. How do you reform societies, and can you, do you have to basically reform societies? A world banker several years ago made a comment that it's always stuck with me, that there's no shortcut to development. There's no silver bullet. Getting a well-managed sovereign wealth fund is not going to make a non-democratic society, a kleptocratic society, open and transparent. This is just, it's one of those things that just takes many, many years. So I'm an optimist by nature, but I don't see a lot of change on the horizon.
Just a quick comment on the point about corporate governance code and stewardship code that you mentioned. Indeed, there is a world coming together of a standard corporate governance code, and by and large, that is what is being followed. But even in the corporate governance code, what is happening in UK, what is happening in US, some quarter of it, there is this I would say, response to the fact that corporate governance code might have become too much of a compliance-based box ticking. And so what is important in whether it's stewardship code or corporate governance code is back to the why. What are you trying to achieve? And if you look at stewardship code, Japanese stewardship code, or starting with UK and across the world, essentially for institutional investor, what you want to achieve is active and responsible institutional investors. So codes and principles must work towards that rather than becoming a form, rather than a spirit of things. Yeah. So by and large, if everybody follow that spirit and codes are in effect according to that substance, then I think the world will be following a certain standard.
Okay, with that note, I'd like to conclude this session. Please join me in giving a big round of applause for the speakers.